still works. Amazing how many people we know. Gail, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Gail. I come from Teaneck, but every time I'm here, I could stop in and learn what it's nice to someone I go back a long time. It was very nice to come to Teaneck and for us one summer.
Yeah.
So it was really nice. We used to come in for Grisha, right?
Yeah.
Miss you.
Thank you.
I thought you would come. Well,
Thank you. I'll be in touch. Okay, great.
I'm Ellen Shaffron. We actually made Aliyah 3.5 years ago,
Okay.
but we still spend a little more time in New York than here.
Okay, back and forth.
I'm glad to come back. I'm really Jerusalem for the past 10 years. I live here. I am in New Jersey.
Debbie finished, officially listed now here. Vicky Leader, yeah, 4.5 years ago, back and forth to Cleveland.
Okay.
Marla Comet, Sir Bridgie from Cleveland, made Aliyah 5 years ago, living.
Barash, okay?
Made Aliyah.
What's your name? We didn't hear it.
Barash, made Aliyah, Elizabeth from Elizabeth, New Jersey, in 1984.
Okay.
And I live in Katamona, though I live near your in-laws.
Okay.
Segula Rutenberg. I'm originally from Cleveland and
Oh, I didn't know.
moved to Muncie and then
What's your name?
Calvin. No, Calvin.
Sibylla.
And my husband and I made Aliyah 3 years ago. We go back and forth also many places. But
Stephanie Hoffman, been here since 1975.
Okay.
And mainly lived in the old city, Jerusalem, until husband's illness lost us to move to Katamon. After he aged out to attend the time, I tried to do it pending several years.
Wonderful.
Barry Barash is your,
Father-in-law.
no, my husband from St. Louis.
Okay. I know that as well. I'll let him know this Shabbat when we spend time with him. And online, Ellen was online, but it seems like she stepped out. Who is S. Kanon? All right, do you want to introduce yourself? Yeah, you're on mute. Okay, if you'd like to unmute. Hi.
Hi, yeah, I'm Susie Kanan, and I've lived in Israel for 40 years. I live in Ma'ale Adumim. I learned with Malka Bina in the 80s, the mid 80s, when Matan was Bruria in Kiryat Moshe, and here I am.
Okay, thank you. Welcome.
Mhm.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming in person. I did an online class, I think the last 2 years, so I'm really happy to be back in the building. I'll talk a little bit about here. Let's pass these out. There you go, Stephanie. Here, yeah, there's enough to go, I think, in each direction, but I'll give you yours. So we're really picking up in the 4th year of this series. Every year stands alone, and I would say almost every class stands alone. In other words, what I do is I go through various Talmudic personalities. And so it is true that sometimes one personality will take more than one class, but the material largely is not material that builds, that if you miss a class, a lot of you said you're traveling back and forth. I hope you won't miss too many classes, but it happens. But really the journey through the early Second Temple period until the late Amoraim is a journey that you can step in and out of and still understand what we're doing and who we're talking about. We're picking up largely at the end of Rebbe's life. I spent a lot of time at the end of last year on Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, the editor, the redactor of the Mishnah. Let me shut the door. And so we looked at Rebbe and Rebbe's relationship with various sages and Rebbe's sons and then Rebbe's death. We're going to pick up with Rebbe Chia. And I think that is Rebbe Chia the Great, who is a colleague of Rebbe. He comes up from Babylonia. He moves to Eretz Yisrael to be close to Rebbe. He moves to Tiberia in order to be in the area of the Sanhedrin. And he comes with his nephew, and this is an interesting family relationship. Rebbe Abba, who's known as Rav. We're going to spend time on Rav. Rav is going to go back to Babylonia and start a yeshiva there. What's interesting, just in terms of mishpachatologia, because this is just a very curious fact. Rav is both the son of Rabbi Chia's brother and Rabbi Chia's sister. Now, his half brother and his half sister, I'll explain. Obviously, Rav's parents are not at all related. They're step siblings, right? Very interesting. Possibly didn't grow up in the same household at all, right? But what happened was Rabbi Chia was the youngest child of Rav's father from a second marriage. And his mother had a daughter from a previous marriage known as Ima. And Ima marries Ivo. In other words, his father had a child from a first marriage. His mother had a child from a first marriage, but they weren't related to one another. And they end up getting married. And Rabbi Abba then is both his his nephew from a half brother and a half sister, which again very interesting. So step siblings essentially married each other. So he and Rav have a complicated family relationship, not surprising, but they also have a teacher-student relationship, which is very interesting and very lovely. We're going to get to know that relationship, and we're going to get to know Rav. One more thing I'll say is, scholars begin coming from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael to learn in the academy there, to learn with Rebbe, to learn with Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. We're even going to see, hi, good morning. We're going to see that the scholars in Eretz Yisrael are not so kind or patient with the scholars from Bavel. There's a little bit of an elitist attitude of, you guys didn't come when it was tough. Is going to sound familiar. You came when things got easier. I see the span of people, and those who are here more than 40 years certainly came when the country was not where it is now. And a little bit of, that sense of, now you came, right? Like we came, the end of Bayit Sheni, things were hard, the Greeks, the Romans, the poverty, and so on. And at the moment, we're in a period of relative goodness, the financial, economic stability. And so it is not as difficult to come. And so we're going to see that in various places where the sages of Eretz Yisrael do not speak so nicely. And I started reading an article, which I hope I'll finish, that said that really reflects this tension. That I know Yael Leibowitz just put out a book about Ezra and Nechemiah, the end of the Shivat Zion. Shivat Zion is really only those who come back who are desperate, who have no choice, those who are in Eretz Yisrael, who have intermarried. It's a motley crew, so to speak. The elite of Bavel stay in Bavel. They have money and the situation is good, and the administration and government are good to them. Yes, history repeats itself. It's astonishing. And then they start to come up. Now, again, the Tanaim have really become powerhouses of Torah study. There are Torah centers in Bavel. They're at the end of the day going to become stronger as the centers in Eretz Yisrael begin to wane as a result of persecution and poverty and so on. But we're going to see that because some of the language is harsh. Rebbe does not always speak nicely to Rabbi Chia. This article suggests that's part of an overall tension between the academies and the sense that, we kind of had to do this with our bootstraps, and you guys were having an easier time in Bavel. And to me, I always like to tap into the cycles in history, the familiarity of tension that we see in complex relationships within families and within communities and within houses of study. And we're going to constantly pick up on that. Hold on, I'm gonna come out. Go ahead.
You said that those that didn't have a choice came here. What do you mean?
Yeah, the people who came back here often just weren't succeeding. Like think in Bavel. The ones who came from Bavel were the ones who had no yichus, right? That's a big thing, that they come, but they have no clear lineage.
So what did Israel offer to them?
In the yes, an opportunity to start over. Koresh basically says it's on Sundays, I teach the first year per day, right? What I did in the first year of this series. So I just reviewed my material. Koresh Cyrus basically proclaims in 520 BCE, come back. And it's part of a Persian approach that they want the citizens of the lands they are now taking over to return and have freedom, religious freedom and autonomy in government. They want to give them, it's very interesting. But, and so opening up the borders. And why do they come back? Probably because they're not, I would say two things. They're not doing so well. They're expats. They haven't found themselves. And they now have an opportunity to start over because there's now religious. Yeah, sure. They want to come back to the land. Absolutely. I want to take that away, the ideology. But if ideology were the leading principle, I would have expected some of the wealthier and more established families to say, let's go back and rebuild the temple. That's what they're doing. And it doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. The second temple is a very poor temple. Again, it takes a while till that community really establishes itself. And so one of the things this article looks at is in Bavel, despite the fact that there's a Beit HaMikdash, right? That the community in Bavel remains a very strong, established, wealthier community for a long time. And Eretz Yisrael is kind of second. Do we come to Israel when there's a temple and it's still harder to live here in many ways, right? Like, I think we can see those patterns. Who comes back in the 19th century when you can begin to come back? It's really Rothschild will support it, right? Rothschild will be helpful and Moshe Montefiore, but they actually don't move here, right? They stay where they are and they send money. So that's very helpful, very important. But who's coming back?
Economic incentive. Darius, did he give an economic incentive to come here?
Yeah, no, he opens up freedom. There's freedom. I don't want to get too stuck in it. There's freedom. There's a freedom of you can come back and practice and you can come back and have some autonomous government. And it's very attractive. But the beginning is not so stable. And even in the times of the Tanaim, we begin to see the Tanaim who come, the sages in Bavel, that's all I want, who make Aliyah. But it's not with open arms that the sages of Eretz Yisrael say, oh, we're so happy you came back. It's more like, oh, now you're coming, right? So that to me is interesting because that tension, of course they're happy they're there, but that tension is a tension I think we can understand people are familiar with, that you come when it's easier to come. So let's get into this. So why is Rabbi Chia so important? We've talked a lot about the Mishnah. I probably should use this. Yeah, sure. Anyone else need a source? Okay, see if I can figure this out. Let's see if it's on. Only because my voice is no. Okay. If someone's in the office and wants to help me with the microphone, that would be great. Rabbi Chia becomes attributed with the authorship of Tosefta. Okay, why? Now I'll talk for a moment about Tosefta and we'll look at the Rambam. So why am I starting with Rabbi Chia? Because we ended with Rebbe. And Rabbi Chia does something really important and really phenomenal that gets a lot of attention in the Gemara. We don't really learn Tosefta. I mean, I would say Professor Saul Lieberman really brings back Tosefta. Obviously in the yeshivas, people knew about Tosefta. But to learn Tosefta as an independent text was something that I want to give Rabbi Professor Saul Lieberman really has a passion for. And so today, when I say Tosefta, people are more familiar with it.
Can you just?
Yeah, I'm about to do that. Yeah, don't worry. Right. Tosefta literally means additional, Tosefet, add-on. It is the Tanaitic material that is not in the Mishnah. It's 4 times as long as the Mishnah. It follows the same sequence and the same tractate chapter order, more or less. But often it's much bulkier, right? It's longer. It's more. There's more text, and scholars love to compare Mishnah and Tosefta to see what Rabbi Yehuda included and what he left out. There's also repetition. Meaning you could read a Tosefta and be like, oh, that's word for word the Mishnah, but then it will continue on with either more opinions or more detail. The Gemara brings in Tosefta as what? As braitas, right? That word braita we're familiar with a little bit. So the braita is extra Tanaitic material that Rebbe didn't put in the Mishnah. Now that's very exciting in the Talmud because it means that I can have a conversation among equally important texts they're all Tanaitic. The Mishnah is given primacy, but the Gemara says, yes, and if I have a Baraita, if I have a piece of Tosefta, then I can begin to argue with the Mishnah, or I can clarify the Mishnah, or maybe even I can override the Mishnah because the Baraita turns out to be the more reasonable position or the more significant position. So Rabbi Chia's work of saying, look, Rebbe, you did a phenomenal job, but there's all this material that hasn't been collected, collated, edited. So he does that work, right? That's what he's given credit for. My guess is he had a group of students who helped him.
So a Tosefta, and a Breita is the same thing, you think?
Breita, yes, the Breita will borrow or quote Tosefta, but there's other Tanaitic material as well. If I say Midrash Halacha, you might also say, oh yeah, Mechilta, Sifra. Those are all examples of Tanaitic material that are classified as Midrash Halacha. I can put it on the board just to give you a visual. When we talk about Breita is also, it means additional material, and it will include Tosefta, right, which we said Rabbi Chia is given credit for, but it will also include Midrash Halacha. If anyone's learning Daf Yomi now, it is not despairing of Zavachim never ending, but Midrash Halacha has Sifra, Sifrei, right, has Mechilta. Those are all, what is Midrash Halacha? We like Midrash Haggadah. It's stories, it's narrative. It's sometimes crazy and it's interesting and it keeps us awake. And I think that was its purpose. Midrash Halacha is a very, almost tear your hair out, interpretive methodology where you take words from the verse and you extrapolate Halacha, but in a way that you're like, really? This is what you're doing to get to the Halacha. So Ram, right, we said his nephew, we're gonna see Rambam's gonna say it, is attributed with a lot of the redaction. Scholars will say, no, it's not only Rav, it's this school, it's that school, it's that school, it doesn't matter. But so we have a Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael. The big players here are Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Their schools of thought, their schools of teaching. So just to understand, the Braitas are pulling from here and from here. These are the sources for when the Gemara says, let's quote a Braita, Tanya, Tanina, right? They're saying we have a Tanaitic text we can bring in to question the Mishnah, challenge the Mishnah, try to understand why a position of a certain Tana looks the way it does. Oh, there's a Braita. Okay, so that's the importance of a Braita. The Tosefta really follows, unlike the Midrash Halacha. Midrash Halacha is verse by verse, all of the books except Reshit. Reshit doesn't have enough halacha in it to make it worthwhile. But the other books, it's almost verse by verse, going through those Sfarim, Shmot, Vayikra, especially Vayikra, right? And stopping on each word, each letter, to try to extrapolate halacha and argue about. It's a little bit like if you pull back a beautiful building and see all the pipes underneath, right? It's sometimes a little jarring, you're like, that's too much information sometimes, unless I guess you're a plumber or an electrician. And a little bit of seeing the pipes of what leads to halachic decision making. It's less popular than Tosefta and Mishnah, which are not about how we got to the position, but what the positions are, right? We know for Mishnah, it's like, when do we say Shema in the nighttime? Well, from the time the Kohanim eat their truma, or until the morning, whatever it is. That's the debate, the positions that are already established. This tries to explain how we get to those positions and where the arguments are in reading Torah. It's less, it's less comprehensive, it's harder. It's harder, it's not, it's yeah, very pedantic, detailed, tedious. There are scholars who love this, of course, and they're very passionate about it. But you really feel like you're in the weeds. Mishnah, at least you're like, okay, here are the positions. They're defining and clarifying things. Here you're like very much in the details of how to get to those positions. So that's just a little bit of a background, right? This is important because this is the period of time we're in. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, if I don't start writing down, editing, collecting, defining, the whole initiative is going to be lost. People need like some framework, 63 tractates of framework. Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, but if you only give us the Mishnah, all of this other information and discourse is going to get lost. So we need people to know that the Mishnah becomes the seminal text, but there's another text that needs to be addressed when the decision makers continue the conversation. The Talmud takes that very seriously. Rav, right? We're not up to yet. We're just glancing at. But Rav, by the way, is not happily married, and Rabbi Chia is not happily married, right? We're going to talk about the role of women in their lives, which I think is interesting. But it's interesting, both parents had second marriages, which doesn't mean divorce and death, presumably, but there's a lot to think about there. But you know, we're the Talmud, the Amoraim come along and say, in order to continue the conversation, we want to look at more texts and then begin to advance the next layer, the next generation, and so on. And of course, that's going to continue. That's going to
Excuse me,
continue.
all this is written down. They're
Yes,
looking
all of it
at-
is written down.
And so they're looking through.
Yeah, how, you know, there's always a debate, how much is still oral? Clearly, things have to be written down.
Right,
Clearly,
because I'm
things have to be
thinking, you
written
know,
down.
what did
Clearly,
he
things have
say?
to be
You
written
know,
down.
it's like.
Right, but
Around 575.
no, all of this, we're in the 3rd century CE. We're in the 3rd century CE. Rebbe dies around 220, and Rabbi Chia is a colleague of his. So let's say we're around 200 right now. A lot of this work is happening between 200 and 300 CE, including the Mishnah. Right, I didn't put the Mishnah up there. I'm hoping that's obvious. I'm talking, you know, I should just out of
This is
respect.
wait, this is after the introduction, first step.
Yes, first temple, thank you guys, usually I start with some history. First temple is destroyed, second temple is destroyed 70 CE. Between 70 CE and 220 CE, that's like the heart of what we'll call the rabbinic enterprise being launched. The Tanaim, right, the period of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, that's all around 120, 140, 150. So in the aftermath of the destruction, right, we begin to rebuild, right, figure out how we're gonna survive, what's gonna hold us, how the Torah is gonna continue. People are scattering, what is Torah scholarship and leadership gonna look like? And that's gonna be in the aftermath of the Second Temple. But it's happening before. I don't want anyone to think they sit down in 80 CE and say, let's do all this. No, that's not, there are hundreds of years from the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, which are 450 BCE until 220 CE. That's really the period in which the halacha as we know it emerges as something that has a methodology and has interpretation and has rabbinic discourse. So that's going to start in 450 BCE. Rabbi Yehuda says it's very nice, all this discourse and discussion, but we need a framework that can last. We're not all going to be together forever. In fact, even now there's Babel and Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is dominant. So, but at some point Babel will be dominant. So the 63 tractates are going to be, we're going to see what Rambam is going to say in a moment. The 63 tractates are going to be very, very important in preserving, right? And allowing further discussion. It never stagnates, it just keeps moving, But the Anshe Knesset Hagadola are the ones who say, look, people have to have set tefillah, they have to have brachot, they have to have kiddush and havdalah, right? So my students are often like, wait, what were they doing before? I don't know, meaning when we talk about 12 tribes and we talk about tribal leadership and tribal fighting and so on, it's a period of time in which Torah is not being practiced in a uniform way or in the way that we would probably be able to identify it. Ezra and Nechemiah, I mean, you're not supposed to worship idols and there's a temple and there's Shabbat, but even Shabbat, when Nechemiah comes back, they're treading on wine, they're treading the grapes. They're bartering, that's not malacha. What's malacha? right? Malacha is out in the fields, maybe. They have to come and they have to begin saying, okay, we need more definition, so everyone keeps Shabbat a certain way. Right, that's it, kashrut, all of those things, we need more definition and uniformity, or it isn't gonna work.
If we landed in the house of one of the rabbis who teach in a yeshiva, would we feel that they are observing Shabbat?
The rabbis of the Tannaitic period, yes. If we go back to the first temple period, I'm not sure. First of all, they might be eating cold food all Shabbat, and we might be like, where's the plata? Right, like, in other words, the things we tend to, and sitting in the dark, right, the question of how, which is what the Karaites do, right? If we wanna see a little bit of what it possibly looked like, the Ethiopian traditions, right, the Ethiopians don't have the Torah Shebaal Peh, they have Torah Shebechtav. And so they're interpreting and working with a much more literal biblical tradition. Of course, the Samaritans and the Karaites as well. There are real differences, and it makes us, I think, a little bit grateful that we had a vaster enterprise of interpretation. There's something very limited about the biblical, the very literal biblical tradition. The oral tradition is much vaster. And it has many more pieces to it, and so even the idea of food and how you can warm food, if you're more of a biblical traditionalist, you're eating cold food and sitting in the dark, and on Yom Kippur, children are fasting, and that to us is very foreign, maybe even babies. They don't have the pikuach nefesh tocha hakol idea that is so clear, like they don't have that interpretation. The way they keep nida, like there are really big distinctions, but some of it is familiar because the original text is Torah. So we can understand what they're doing, and we can also say, oh, that's really interesting that our tradition became a much more the Torah is the anchor. Everything goes back to Torah and to God. But the idea that lo b'shamayim he means that we have an ability to have a methodology of interpretation is very important. So much so that I forget, maybe it was Rabbi Akiva who says, we don't have nevuah, and that's okay. Like, we have the 13 principles of hermeneutics, of methodology, of interpreting Torah. We don't need neviah, right? We can figure out what to do from within the words and spaces of Torah. And of course, Rabbi Akiva is known for like every detail, every like finding ways of interpreting. So it all goes back to Torah. It's all anchored by Torah, and it's not being made up in 70 CE. Nothing's being made up. But I would say this whole idea of people need to know what to do. Ezra and Nechama, everyone was quoting the Sukkot Sukkim, because it says, it has the word vishevi, to return, but like you'll return, and on Sukkot, and the hostages came back on Hoshana Rabbah, so that became a very big, people were quoting that a lot. Ezra, they don't know how to keep, they're listening to the Torah. Nashim v'taf. First of all, the women, unlike at Sinai where we don't specifically hear of the women, Ezra and Nehemiah read Torah from like early morning until noon, like 6-7 hours of just reading them the Torah, and they're crying and they're like, we never heard this before, right? Like we didn't know all this, and they're overwhelmed. And then Ezra and Nehemiah say, no, go home and rejoice. It's Rosh Hashanah, it's the first day of the 7th month. Go home and have meals.
Hello?
Yes, hold on one second.
I was not here. Good morning, Akiva. Check upstairs. He has to leave at 10:30.
Diana, can you mute yourself? Do you mind?
Oh, I am so sorry. I didn't realize it wasn't muted. Thank
Yes, that's why I'm letting you know. Okay, so that Ezra has to tell them essentially what to do. Shofar is not present yet, right? What Trula is, and then he tells them how to build Sukkot. So Ezra becomes important because we begin to see an awareness from the rabbinic leadership that, and he's a Kohen, of course, that people need more like you can't just tell people go sit in Sukkot. You actually have to tell people how to build the sukkah. And then if you open Tractate Sukkot, it's very detailed. What materials you use, what height it has to be, and then the pushback is now you're being too pedantic. Like why are you making why so many details, right? Certainly from the sectarians who are like, this is ludicrous. Like, look how detailed. But I think Chazal understood, if you don't give people clear instruction and definition, there's it's hefker, like, right, and then, of course, that could become an extreme also, and it does sometimes. But this is all evolving and developing as we get through Bayit Sheni. The same meticulous attention to korbanot is gonna be given to tefillah, to the sukkah, to the shofar we're gonna use, which, by the way, I think I checked this, that, I don't know if it's the Ethiopians or the Karaites, they yell. A kol truah means a shout, right? Literally. How do you know to use a shofar? Well, because on Yom Kippur, in Yovel, it says to use a shofar. Well, how do I get that to, like, the whole process, it's all from the Torah, it's all bringing together psukim, but you also can understand that there could have been a different way of practicing.
Right.
And I do believe, and you know, that in Bayit Rishon, it's a little bit like whatever tribe you're in, whatever shofet nasi you have, that's what it's gonna look like. It's gonna look different. And of course, the kingdom split. So if we say, oh, well, there's a king, no, there isn't one king, there are two kings, and one of the kings is always corrupt in Malchut Yisrael. So what do they know to do? So that's why this period of time, I'm much more of a rabbinic scholar than a biblical scholar. But of course, it all goes back to Torah. I'm fascinated by this emergence. Like, it's very, very powerful and very, very a very, very important time period. And this year is opening relatively late in the process. But what Rabbi Chia does is no less important than everything I'm talking about, which is saying there can't be one final text. Only the Torah is an absolute text. And even the Mishnah, so important, but it's Rebbe, right? It's a human initiative. And so there has to be Tosefta, right? There has to be a parallel text. Rambam comes along and says, all you need is me and my Mishnah Torah. And his buddies say to him, no, like your Mishnah Torah. By the way, look at his language, Mishnah Torah. I'm taking the Torah, you still need the Torah. Of course, he's not trying to replace Torah, but he's saying, look, this could be it. And they're like, no, you're gonna be an important voice, but we're gonna keep going. There's gonna be other Rishonim, there's the Rush and the Rif and the, like, there's no one absolute text after the Torah. And I think Rabbi Chia comes and says, it can't, the Mishnah, yes, and Tosefta. And then the Talmud comes along and says, yes, Mishnah and Tosefta, and Midrash Halacha, and we're gonna keep the conversations going. And the interpretation and the reflection and the rethinking and the pulling pieces together and trying to resolve inconsistencies. And here we are, right? Here we are.
Very basic question.
Yes, please.
What is our tradition? Like, somehow I always remember learning that it wasn't only the Torah we received at Sinai, but the oral law. So what of this supposedly came to Moshe?
So I would say, look, I'm gonna be very, I can't, no one can answer that question, because from the time Moshe receives the Torah in 1300 BCE until the Mishnah 220 CE, that's 1500 years without anything digital, right? Now, why do I say that? Because what is memory? And are they, right, if we talk about oral tradition, things get lost, things get reinterpreted, things get, right, we've got the 12 tribes, everyone living not always peacefully with one another. We have the exile, we have the destruction of the first temple. So I'm gonna be cautious. I'm gonna say, I believe Moshe gives them a way of, right, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, and he gives it to Yoshua. My feeling is he gives a way of interpreting, right? Here's the Torah, Sefer Devarim, my favorite approach to Sefer Devarim, now I will be biblical, is that Moshe writes it with God's approval, right? There's a whole debate, Elu Devarim, right? That are these Moshe's words, or like the rest of the Torah, did God dictate it? I'm gonna go with Barbanel on this and other Parshanim that are totally from, that it really is Moshe's Torah, Devarim, based on his awareness of God's word, and God approves it, right? Obviously, God is very present in Sefer Devarim, very, very present. But it's Moshe talking to the people in a voice of like, guys, this is what I've learned from my 40 years talking to God, Yom V'Laila. These are the social structures you have to set up. This is the, be very aware of choice, the whole idea of human choice, such a beautiful idea that is reflected over and over. There's good, there's bad. If you choose good, you'll be rewarded. Choose bad, you'll be punished. So I think already there, I'm going to take that, even if you don't want to agree with me and you want to say that's also the word of God. I think God is in Sefer Devarim. Moshe is already teaching them that you have to put yourselves into Torah. You have to live Torah. Now, what's gonna happen when geography changes and food
I
changes?
just want to ask you quickly, do you have like a chart or something? Like, you
I have
know,
a
what,
chart I will send out about when all of these texts were written. Yes, I usually, thank you.
also like for the Rebbeim and we, you
Yes.
know, and who,
Yes, I have a chart. I'll send you a chart.
okay, thank you.
That's a very good idea. I'll have them send it to the class. Well, if you signed up, the office will send, I'll send it to the office and the office will send it to you.
May I say something here?
Yes. Go
I-
ahead.
After many years of learning and not remembering the way I would like to remember for a math exam in school, I find that it's better to remember what you can without a chart, and then next time remember more, because you remember it and you believe it.
Yeah, Ellen, you are a Torah Shabbat Peh person, right? You are an oral Torah, but that idea of,
You're making me cry.
a little deeper, a little bit deeper. But then we also understand for some people that information gets lost. Some people remember more, but some people forget.
Okay.
But thank you. So I think Moshe does give them a way of passing it down, but to suggest that all of Bnei Israel are doing the same thing throughout the years of the split of the Malchut, Sefer Devarim gets lost, right? Chizkiyahu finds Sefer Devarim and everyone's like, oh my God, we never knew this.
No, I never heard that.
You didn't know that? Oh, it's in Sefer Malachim. If you learn through Sefer Malachim, you're like, huh, okay. Everything I was taught in my more Haredi schools can't historically be true. It can ideologically be true, conceptually be true. But they don't have, they never keep, they're like, we never kept Pesach like this, we didn't keep Sukkot like this, right? Things evolve. Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, there's a limit to how far things can, like, we need now to stop, do all this, collect with machloket, right? If you learn Mishnah, you know not everyone agrees, so that also goes back to, well, Moshe gave it at Sinai, why doesn't everyone know exactly what Moshe said? Because 1,500 years is a long time. I mean, we're lucky we have the Torah, which was written down and stayed the same. So I think that people are trying to live according to the word of God, unless they're worshiping idols in Malachim, which they're doing a lot of. But they're trying to live by the word of God. And the idea of what is leket shekhan peah? What does that exactly look like? It's very nice that I'm told to live I'm gonna go to the corner of the field. What does that look like? How much of my field? People need to know, because there are two kinds of people. The ones who are gonna do too much and the ones who are gonna do much too little. But if I don't have definition, I can get away with more. If I don't have definition, I could give everything away. Right? Like I could just be like, my whole life has to be, right? So it's so important, this rabbinic initiative. We can say marriage and divorce. Marriage actually isn't written in the Torah, like how to get married. So Chazal come along and say, but clearly marriage is written as v'lakah, right? People get married, but we need a ceremony. We need, right? We're gonna call it kiddushin for a very specific reason. We're gonna have ketubah for a very specific reason, right? Like all of these things that we take for granted are not built in. They are extrapolated from values and from words of Torah, right? We know we have divorce, so obviously we have a divorce ceremony in the Torah, but we don't have a marriage ceremony in the Torah. So that's where that comes from. Lineage, right? Like just defining things. What is the word mamzer? So they're gonna have to define who that is. What is that? Things evolve. Things need to be clarified. So let's take a look at what the Rambam says. Yes.
That's the question. So you have the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli. So if this was written in Israel, this would be the Talmud Bavli.
Yes. Oh, you guys are great. I really should have come with the introduction to the Talmud text, but we're not touching Talmud. Okay, so let me just do this. 1300, because some of you asked for something more written. BCE was Torah. By the way, that means 1800 more or less BCE is Avraham, right? And if we go to the Babylonian Museum or to the Israel Museum, the early Canaanite period looks a lot like when Avraham would have lived. Like it's very, archaeology is very interesting and it helps us. Okay. The monarchy is around 900 BCE. Monarchy, which splits. It's a very important piece of understanding all this, right? The monarchy splits. By the way, if your king is worshiping idols, what does your Shabbos look like? Like what are you doing? Right? It's very complicated. I think there have always been the few that have preserved the tradition from Sinai on, but even then, what does that exactly mean? Okay, 586 destruction. And the part that destruction, and around 520 rebuilding. I'm in BCE, of course, okay, and this is Ezra, Nehemiah, men of the Great Assembly. I will bring you a printout, I'll send this, but you can write it if it's helpful for you, right, that's fine, I know that I take notes just to remember. I never look at them, I don't even always look at them again, but just by writing it, for me, it's helpful. Okay, Ezra, Nehemiah, so basically from 520 till 70 CE is Bayit Sheni, and a lot happens, right, a lot happens. So the Persian period is great, and we have the men of the Great Assembly, and we have Kiddush, and we have Damdala, we have all those things that they begin saying, it's not enough to just bring in Shabbos. You have to say something, right, like, that's an innovation, that you're gonna bring in Shabbos with Kiddush and end it with Havdalah. Which, by the way, there's a debate, you have the candle, like the whole thing about the candle and Kiddush obviously on wine, but the texts of the Kiddush. Shmona Esrei and Birkat HaMazon, those are four things, Anshe Knesset Agdola, everyone agrees they innovate. Right now you could say, how could they do that? Because they recognize people need a way to connect to God. It's not enough to be at home and know the Kohen is saying all sorts of things in the temple. That was more or less the relationship with God. Yes, your home you couldn't eat milk and meat and you couldn't work on Shabbos. That was for everybody. Those were things. You had to go to the mikvah if you were in need of. But largely, you were thinking about the Kohen, that's what you're supposed to think about the Kohanim. They represent you to God. They bring the sacrifices. They have whatever language they're saying. And Danshe Knesset Agdola come along and say, you know, that's really not enough for the farmer inside. Like he needs a way every day to connect to God. And so that language is going to be prayer. He needs to thank God before and after he eats, right? With a language. Baruch atah Hashem. Then we get to Shabbos. People need a way to bring it with ritual, right? So it's an innovation, right? That doesn't go back. I want to give them the credit that they deserve. But it's recognizing that alongside the temple, not instead of the temple, that's going to be later when the second temple is destroyed, but even alongside it, there needs to be something for the majority of the nation to be doing, because it's just not enough. And of course, this is before the kahuna becomes corrupted, and in Bayit Sheni, the kahuna gets corrupted, and notice in Pirkei Avot, no mention of the Kohanim. Right, that's a very deliberate excision. Right, like the kahuna did not work as religious leadership, which means the whole enterprise of like one type of person representing me is that I have to represent myself before God. So that's what's happening there, yes. Hannah.
In the time, at the time of Ezra Nehemiah, how far did the Israelite, either side, whatever, how far did it extend? When you say they're talking to not only Jerusalem, how far are they talking?
Yeah, so that's where you need it, right, so I mean, I could probably get a map, but Rial Leibowitz would be better off explaining this. But no, people are not only living in Jerusalem, they're scattered throughout the country. I'm gonna suggest, and this is totally, like, the Tzfat to Beersheba, that area, the Galil certainly remains, it's constantly being excavated and things are being found. You know, like in terms of farmland also, Jerusalem is not the best farmland, right? We need the flat plains in the center of the country. So I don't know exactly, right, where in Bayit Sheni people, how far the reach is, but by the end of Bayit Sheni, they're all over, right? Like north and south, so much so, yes, up by what we would call Tsur, up by Tsur. Rabbi Gamliel talks about going to Tsur to visit, which is Tyre, which is up in Lebanon, right, the coast. He talks about going there to visit Jewish communities. So the Jewish communities are gonna be scattered around the country, and as a result, getting to the temple is gonna be burdensome and expensive, and so like, how often can people make a pilgrimage? Right, if I'm a poor farmer all the way up north, I'm gonna have to save all my money to make that pilgrimage and maybe make it twice a year, and if my wife is giving birth, she can't come. So we love the idea that everyone makes Aliyah L'Regel. Guys, we have cars and trains and planes and buses. it's not as big a deal unless they close the road, which they're doing today, I think, right? When Trump came, they closed the highway and everyone's suddenly in a panic, we can't get to Jerusalem. But we're spoiled in a sense that, thank God, I'm very grateful, that we don't really understand the difficulty of travel. Right, we're exhausted and jet lagged, and I hate jet lag, but we can't even imagine what it's like to be on a donkey or a camel or a boat to get from one country to another, right? Like it's and dangerous and expensive. So we have in our mind a lovely idea that everyone goes up to Jerusalem. But if you begin to think about it, they obviously can't all go up to Jerusalem, right? Which means that idea that my whole religious experience is from this ecstasy 3 times a year, that just, not shaking us on a good come along and say, that's not gonna be enough. And one more thing I'll share, well, thank you for bringing me back to this. Ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanora. That language that's in Shemona Esrei, God who is gadol, who is great, who is a gibor, who is a hero, strong, v'nora, awesome. That's language borrowed from Moshe, so here we have a connection to Moshe, okay? It becomes something that every Jew, man and woman, because women are obligated in Shemona Esrei, is expected to say 2 to 3 times a day. That's very powerful. That I declare God, Gadol Gibor V'Norah, right? And they're saying, you all need to do that several times a day in order to be in relationship with God. It can't be just moments of ecstasy at pilgrimage. That's not going to be a sustainable long-term relationship. Think about our own relationships with our children, with our spouses, with our friends, the ones that are most like the fun ones are the ones that we see, our childhood friends that we see once a year or once every other year are awesome, that you can pick up, it's like you continue conversations going back from 15, but they don't require a lot of work, right? It's almost like a moment of ecstasy. But the ones that we're in relationship with every day, those require a lot of work, but they're also very, very meaningful, right? They're the ones that nurture and support us on a regular basis. So they look at God and they say, we want people to be in constant ongoing relationship. It can't just be a thought of, oh, now the Kohen's bringing my sacrifice, or now I'm gonna go up to the temple, wow, like that's gonna be ecstatic. And if someone gets sick along the way, you're not so ecstatic. So that's what starts happening here. And then Bayit Sheni, and this is not, I would recommend, I think Malka Simkovich and Torah in Motion has a great series, and it's possible someone here teaches Bayit Sheni. But there's a lot of sectarianism. What do I mean by that? People are fighting of their interpretation of Torah is going to become the primacy. It's not we, again, if you grow up in Orthodox education, the Baijusim and the Stukim are bad, and the Kohanim and the Prushim are good, right? Like it's very binary. But if you get into it a little more deeply, you recognize everyone has Torah at their center, and then the fighting is over, how do we interpret and pass on Torah? Some of them are fighting for a more literal interpretation. They're saying to the rabbis, who do you think you are? The Torah says this very clearly, and you're now saying, no, it doesn't mean that. Like I have a vav, and now I can change the meaning. I can reinterpret. These are really big meta theological fights about the word of God and who has a kind of authenticity in understanding the word of God. I think what the rabbis do saves Judaism and also really brings the word of God into our lives in a very profound and sustainable way. I don't think they would, but that's what's happening in Bayit Sheni, and it gets very, very heated, of course. And some of the Jews Hellenize, of course, which makes it more complicated, right? Because the Greeks want to take away the Torah. Unlike the Persians, the Greeks want everyone to be the same. Everyone should be in awe of Greco, like the Greek brilliance, culture, philosophy, science, language. Everyone. No distinction. Everyone can be equal in the eyes of the Greeks if you just buy it. And the Jews don't, right? And so that creates some of the tension that's going on. And again, these things just recur in our history all time, right? I'll just, because we're a week after the miraculous release of the hostages, Hashem, right? Like what a powerful moment. Ram Broslavsky said, they said to him, if you convert to Islam, we'll give you more food. Mm-hmm. Now, he didn't come from an observant home, right? Like, where does that come from? And by the way, here I am as the intellectual, I love this. I'm like, well, converting to Islam is not like converting to Christianity. I'm like, I'm not, it's a lot of the, right? Certainly, there are texts that say, well, if you have to save your life, converting to Islam is, converting to Christianity, you might have to give up your life because of the Trinity, but Islam is not the same thing. And he doesn't even, like, that's irrelevant to his experience. His experience is, no, I'm not letting you take away the essence of who I am. I'm not gonna convert even for more food, right? And of course, I'm with pikuach nefesh, and like, but you hear these stories in the Holocaust also, that people refuse to eat on Yom Kippur even though it endangers their life. Where does that come from? So I would say Bayit Sheni brings up a lot of these questions of, how do I hold on to, what is Jewish identity? How do I hold on to Jewish identity? What is observance? What is ritual? That's all gonna happen in Bayit Sheni. We just Anshe Knesset Agdola, Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Great, and then we have the Zugot, the pairs, right? That's the rabbinic leadership. Often they don't agree. What's beautiful about the pairs is they don't agree with one another, but they respect one another and they lead together, right? That's what they do. They don't agree methodology once. Hillel and Shaman, right? They really don't agree, but they are the two. It's very important to actually have different leadership, right? Different leadership styles. And so then we get to 70 CE destruction, and what happens here? I have to say, I taught all of this that first year, no, not all of this here. As the social justice reform was unfolding, and every time I walked into class, we would all be like, this is just too close for comfort, like this is insane. So many familiar parallels. So we have the destruction. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he says to Vespasian, give me Yavne. Does not say save the temple. And he makes it clear why. The temple's been corrupted. The temple has caused pilug, disunity, right? It's become extreme. It's taken over by zealots. And he basically understands, first of all, even if he got Jerusalem, it's gonna fall. Like it would be a temporary fix. He needs something long-term, and he says, give me Yavne and the sages. Like, we're gonna have to hunker down, and we're gonna have to it's not so much rebuild, we have to figure out what the next stage in our history is gonna be. And it's not gonna be temple, the temple is over, is being destroyed. And so he rebuilds in Yavne, that's 70 CE, and then emerges the period of the Tanaim. Right, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is here. I'm just saying his name because it's so prominent, and what he does is so deliberate. He has, I'll just share, there's a crazy story where basically he goes to the zealots and he says to them, like, you've got to stop fighting with the Romans, they're gonna destroy us. And they're like, no, not even for a moment. And they create, oh, I know what it is, it's terrible. The wealthy men of Jerusalem open up their storehouses to support the starving people because there's a siege. And the zealots burn down the storehouses of food, of Jewish storehouses, right? Because they want the people to go fight with them against the Romans. Like, it's so sad, it's so tragic.
Listen, I'm going to say something here because my last name is Stern. I want to say something. This story might not be true. I've heard it for many years, but I want you to know that it could be a tremendous lie.
Yeah, okay, so Ellen, it's a story. I'm gonna agree with you. I'm just saying what Rabbi Yochanan is seeing is we're gonna come back.
Right, but he has a reason for telling this.
The reason to go to Yavne, absolutely. So moving to more hopeful, right? I explained the end of Bayit Sheni is dark for all the reasons that we know, destruction, exile, and so on. But the beauty is the cycle doesn't end there. Now we're on an uptick. And the uptick is we get stronger. It's amazing, we get stronger. And we get stronger through the study and the dissemination of Torah. That's where we are now. And that's where we're going to land, okay? Dissemination of Torah, and really here we have obviously Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Tarfon, right? They're actually his teachers, but I'm putting Rabbi Akiva because we all know Rabbi Meir, right? We have the stars of the Tannaitic period, who really their whole initiative is to learn and transmit Torah and to clarify for the people what they have to do and to keep the people engaged, to keep the people wanting to practice, wanting to be, part of this initiative. And now we're picking up 220 CE is the Mishnah. Okay, and that's where we're picking Mishnah and Tosefta. Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia, and that's who we're at. Rebbe comes from the Gamliel family, which traces itself back to Hillel and back to David HaMelech. That's why they're a very important family. They are the like kingly family, if you will. They're not monarchs, they are, but they are very, very well positioned financially, educationally, politically, and so on to lead. And Rabbi Chia is an incredible scholar who comes in alongside them. When you asked about the Talmud, I'll just now, because I've run out of room and because we're not gonna, we're gonna enter this period and I'll do a separate discussion. The Talmudic era, what we'll call the Amoraim, is from 220 as far as the to 400 is the Yerushalmi. And really 220 to 600 is the Bavli. Okay, we are learning Bavli. Some of the stories we're gonna see are Yerushalmi, it's true, because I'm doing stories and not straight on the daf. But a lot of what's in the Bavli from this period of time is earlier. It gets edited for a much longer period. It's why it's easier to study. It's easier to study Bavli.
It's different.
Yeah.
When we're doing the doc, it was, it's not all the same.
The Yerushalmi, no, it's not the same. No, it's not the same, and the editing is different. It's a much rougher text. It has a different language to it and a different way of presenting. It's much more what's called Galilean Arabic. This is Babylonian Arabic. And this has such clear editing. Like, it's a pleasure once you learn how to, it's very hard. Learning Talmud is very hard, and right now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Alan, wait, let me just finish, okay?
Yes, but I'm going to say this and then you can kill me. I don't care.
Okay, sure.
I want to say this, that the rabbi who said that we burned the things, the
Yeah.
food, he should have worked for the PLO.
Okay, Ellen, thank you. I think we're gonna stop there. Okay, I hear you. It's a very disturbing text, but it is an important text that reflects conflict at a period of time. And we, in our own period, have seen conflict within our nation that has become very unsettling. So I'm gonna leave that. We're not.
Avanti,
Text. We're
okay.
gonna. So this is a very different Talmud. And very few people learn. Now there's a whole trend to do Yerushalmi Daf Yomi. The Ger Hasidim bring back the Yerushalmi in the 20th century, and Rabbi Professor Saul Lieberman brings back the Yerushalmi, right? Academia and Ger learn Yerushalmi because they love Eretz Yisrael. But for 1500 years, people are learning much more learning Bavli. Yes, 2 comments, and then I want to get to the Rambam.
But in composing both, were they in conversation with each other, Babel and Israel?
Babel and Israel are in conversation. I don't believe the editors of the Talmud are working separately, but there are sages from Babel go to Eretz Yisrael, sages from Eretz Yisrael go to Babel. Yeah, of course, the sages in Babel know very well what's happening in Eretz Yisrael and vice versa, but it does have a different flavor and a different sensibility. Sometimes the halachic decisions are a little different. Sometimes a posek will go back. I can think of 1 or 2 cases. I'm not enough of a Talmidah Chachama, but sometimes the Yerushalmi will be significant in a decision making, in decision making, but largely the Bavli becomes what all the Rishonim comment on, and as a result, it has a primacy and a centrality in halachic process that the Yerushalmi doesn't have. But they're aware of Yerushalmi. Many Rishonim will bring Yerushalmi as well as Bavli in a discussion. It's not like it remains on a shelf and no one knows about it. They do, but the Bavli becomes the central text of study, and as a result, it's easier to learn because as I said, the editing is much clearer, and the way you break down a sugya, it has a clearer literary structure, I would say. Although once you start learning Yerushalmi, you learn that as well. It is rougher. Okay, yes, Audrey, and then let's take a look at the Rambam.
So that's written in.
No, the Talmud Bavli was written in Babel, and the Talmud Yerushalmi was written in Eretz Yisrael. During the Amoraim, the majority moved to Babel. Right, that's by 450, there's very little left. It remains till about 600, but the centers of study have shifted. Pompedita and Sura and Naharda and all those places, they become the anchors. Yeah, at a certain point, there's not, by 450, it's gonna be much more about Babel. That's 150 years, 200 years that they continue learning and discussing and editing. So Ravina and Ravashi, who are at the end of the kind of the Babylonian Talmud period, and then we have editors, what's called Stamaim, the anonymous editors, are going to be around 450, and already by then they've finished the Yerushalmi. Like, so that again, it ends, that phase, that period ends, and the next period opens up. Yeah.
Is there an essential difference in the fact, is one more the Babli like Galut oriented, like, and the
People say,
other, and the other more,
So
we're here.
people
like,
will
how do
say
we
that,
run here,
yeah,
Israel?
yeah, good question. So people will say that the Yerushalmi is Talmud Eretz Yisrael, and we need to bring that back, and we need to learn that. Again, I'm not enough of an expert to, I've heard that, and that's why I think Ger starts learning it, which I think is fascinating, in the 20th century, and they start making Aliyah very early in the 20th century, before the Second World War, which is why I think they were less affected. They obviously suffered loss, but there was already a community here. Torah Eretz Yisrael. There are definitely scholars who have written about Torah Eretz Yisrael being different than Torah Galut, and some say today Eretz Yisrael has become kind of the primacy in terms of halachic decision making and discourse. Like Eretz Yisrael has become very, very strong in Torah scholarship at this time, and some will say has exceeded what's happening outside of Eretz Yisrael, even though there's a lot of Torah learning outside. But this bringing back of Torah to Eretz Yisrael, I love that. Okay, let's get to the Rambam. All of that was a very lengthy background. Thank you for sticking with me. We're only going to have time. We really didn't get to Rabbi Chia, so hold on to these. I hope that was at least, interesting and meaningful and critical.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at the Rambam introduction to Mishnah. We're just going to step in a little bit. This will even be helpful with what the background I just gave you. Achar kein ra'a lihistabek pek mishemot hamakubalim ala krovim elav mishimon hatzadik vayu dvarav b'mishnah dvar katzar v'kolel inyanim rabim vaya kol muvuar lo lachdod sichlo. אבל למישהו הוא פחות ממנו העניין ההוא עמוק בעיניו שהחכמים הכתובים לא היו מחברים אלא לנפשותם. Let's take a look at the English now. I like to read the Rambam in Hebrew. His Hebrew is very clear, but he says Rebbe, when he says he saw it fit to suffice with the names of those that received the tradition, starting from Shimon HaTzadik, who's 300 BCE, right? Quite a few hundred years before Rebbe. And he says Shimon HaTzadik spoke in very terse words, but for Shimon HaTzadik, it was very lucid, right? He spoke briefly, but it wasn't enough, right? Rambam's here is saying, look, Rebbe goes all the way back. He's not sitting down in 220 CE and making anything up, God forbid. No, mamash, no, how could he? It's 2,500, 2,700 Mishnahs. He goes back all the way back to start with Shimon HaTzadik, but Shimon HaTzadik was terse, right? Like he wrote in shorthand. And because he was so smart, but it's too complex. It was too complex for the people. So Rebbe has to begin to expand out from the terseness. What else needs to be imparted? So he's showing us the process. Lefichach ra'a echad mitalmidav v'hu Rabbi Chia, right? Already here, one of his students, Rabbi Chia, did what he did in a way. Lechaber sefer v'lalechet bo achar rabo. So Rabbi Chia says, oh, you did that to Shimon HaTzadik and onward. I'm now going to do that to you, right? Because I think the Mishnah is great, but as I said, Tosefta is 4 times as long. And he says, I think it's worthwhile to expand outward on the things that you left out in order to make it clearer to people what else was being said at that time. You made choices. Maybe I'll even bring in an example next week to compare Mishnah to Tosefta. That'll be, I think, interesting, and I'll bring a good example. And he basically says, you brought 3, very concise positions, But really, one of those positions had a lot more examples, and I think it's worthwhile to bring in those examples so people know what we're talking about, right? So he says, Rabbi Chia just followed in his way. V'hi ha-tosefta. That's the Tosefta. V'inyano leva'er ha-mishnah. And the idea was to elucidate or expand upon the Mishnah. V'tosefta afshar lotzi tama me'ha-mishnah achar yigia rabba. He says, look, if you really want, now this I'm going to disagree with the Rambam, but he says it. I understand why he says it. He says, if you really wanted to, and you sat for many hours on the Mishnah, you could get to the Tosefta. Now, I don't see how that could be true because there are very specific examples in the Tosefta that, like, I don't think I would be able to come to that some of the Tanaim bring. But he's saying, really, if all of us were incredibly brilliant scholars and we remembered everything, then we could get to the Tosefta. But okay, he does it the way Rebbe does it for Shimon HaTzadik's words. Like, people need more. More is more, not less. Okay. The Tosefta achar yagia rabba v'hu hotzia lelamdenu he'ech nolid v'notzi inyanim me'hamishna v'ken asa Rabbi Yoshaya. So he says Rabbi Chia starts that, he extrapolates things from the Mishnah to bring out matters from the Mishnah, and so does Rabbi Yoshaya. And now v'rav chiber braita. I've already told you Tosefta is also braita, but he's saying beyond the Tosefta, there's also braita, and that's the Sifra and the Sifrei, right? That's why it's good we did what we did. He says Rav is really the one who collated all of this materials. V'rabim zulatam kamosha amru ki ata Rebbe Ploni ata va'aite metanita biada. And he says others came as well. Like as each of these men are collecting, someone would show up from Bavel or Eretz Yisrael and say, hey, I have a braita. Do you know this one? Right? Like you see that in the Gemara. They say it, that so-and-so showed up and had in his hands a braita no one else knew. Right? So we tend to think like, oh, you sit down and you write it all and you send the book for publishing. No, the Gemara makes it clear there's still kind of lost braitas or braitas that individuals are holding from their learning that everyone gets very excited. Like we've discovered a new braita, and that now becomes part of the collection. V'ulam lo hayu elu habraitot kulam kitzachot divrei HaMishnah. So Rambam is basically going to say nothing is as smooth as the Mishnah, nothing is as organized as the Mishnah, and that's why the Mishnah becomes the main text. And he has to explain. By the way, Professor Dr. David Weiss Halivni writes a book called Mishnah Midrash Halacha, and he also explains why this, even though this is Torah, this is like, why are we learning Midrash Halacha? Literally, you have to open the Torah and go through like every verse. He says this is just too bulky and complex and convoluted. The Mishnah becomes the primary text because it's so well organized, and so there's a clarity to it and a smoothness to it. The Rambam saying the same thing 1,000 years earlier. Like you might be thinking, you readers, so why are we learning Mishnah? Why don't we just learn Tosefta and Midrash Halacha instead? Like what's the big deal? And he says, no. The Mishnah becomes the primary text because it's the most well organized, the most smooth, and everyone. Just look at number 5. I finish this. Everyone that came after this honored composition only came to devote his attention and effort to reflecting upon the words of the Mishnah. And one generation after another did not cease from reflecting upon it, investigating it, explaining it, every sage according to his wisdom and his understanding. And they disagreed about the explanation of some laws in it, right? The Rambam goes on. This is a very long chapter. And it has, I don't know, 40 plus seifim. But I just brought you 6. I think I started with 2, 1. And what does he say? They disagree due to the many years that intervened, which answers your question. I remember the last name Stark. Hold on, give me a minute. Marla. So the Rambam basically says, look, guys, it's so many hundreds of years. Like people can't remember with incredible accuracy everything they've learned. Ellen can, right? Ellen, I love it that the more you learn, the more you remember, right? Some people can, but a lot of people can't. And he says there's so many years that even how to explain the laws, you need to re-examine and re-explain. And there was no group of sages that did not reflect on the Mishnah and reveal novel understandings until it came to the time of Ravina and Rav Ashi. And Rav Ashi then composes the Talmud and saw fit for himself to do this after our holy rabbi. And when our holy rabbi, look what he says, had done for the words that came after Moshe, right? We now have a clear chain. Moshe, Rebbe, Rav Ashi. Right, like that's all you need. Forget Ezra and Nehemiah. I put in Ezra and Nehemiah. He says, really, he goes all the way back to Moshe and he begins to collect all of the different traditions, interpretations that are floating around different Batei Midrash, hidden all sorts of all over the country. And he goes and collects them and he does that to the words of Moshe. And now then Rav Ashi comes and says, okay, there's been, Rav Ashi is around 450. So there's been already another 230 years. So much more information needs to be collected. And the last 150 years of the Bavli is what's called the redaction or the editing, or like, okay, Rav Ashi did a great job, but now we need transitions and introductions, and we need to make we need people to know when to start and stop the dialogue. Like, what is it? How do we learn this? So I want to conclude there. We're going to pick up with Rabbi Chia next week, but we're at a very important period of time, the launching of the Amonaitic period. But we're still in the late Tannaitic period, this transition, and how are we going to enter the next stage? What are we going to allow? What are the sages going to be doing as the Mishnah is done, the Tosefta is being done, and how are they going to continue this conversation? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
That's very good.
I